humor is an incredibly powerful way to communicate about social issues. I see some nodding heads. It's very exciting. And so in a study about the show Scrubs, researchers wanted to understand, using this idea of transportation into the story, is there a limit? If we are being funny about the social issue, do people discount the message? So what they found in this one project was, if you are being funny on the nose about the social issue, in this case it was unintended pregnancy, people were discounting the message, right? But if you were funny around the issues, there was humor surrounding it, their attitudes actually changed much more favorably. And so there's something going on there, right? So is this the end of what we know about humor? No. So in a separate project that inspired a lot of the work that I'll talk to you about in a minute, researchers wanted to know, if you think about somebody like Chris Rock, right? So Chris Rock is an observational comic. He's funny because he's talking about crappy stuff that he sees around him, racism, sexism, classism, right? And so they wanted to understand, if Chris Rock's humor, do you discount it because you know it's funny and you know it's coming from Chris Rock? So what they found was, in the short term, people said, I like Chris Rock, and I like his funny stuff, but I'm now I'm not really buying it on the social issues. But what happened a week later, and weeks after that, they observed something called a sleeper effect. They named it a sleeper effect, not called a sleeper effect. So what that means is that they discovered that actually the comedy in the longer term settled in, and so it was more persuasive over time because people held on to the information and they retained the social information, they believed it. And so the sleeper effect of comedy made it even more powerful. And so, but the idea is, it's very exacting about comedy, but comedy on social issues is very hard to do. And so the idea is, if you have the comedy and then you immediately resolve the comedy with the real information about the social issue, that may be the way to do it. So is there a project like that? Yes. Okay, here's an image that we're probably all familiar with, whether or not we think we're familiar or not. This is a stand-in iconic image that says global poverty. It says hunger, famine, disease, illness, right? So how can we tell stories about global poverty? We may be desensitized because there is a sameness to the way that we tell stories about global poverty. So these are the Millennium Development Goals. The world's pact to end the worst systemic poverty in the world, where people live on $1 a day, 4 billion people around the world, 1.2 billion people, sorry, that was way off. How can we communicate about these stories to, in the case of this project, to a Western audience that's totally desensitized? We've seen it all, we don't know what to do, it feels like a huge issue, we don't know what to do about it. And so a group of us wanted to find out, and so I, with a couple of partners, producing partners, got together, and the Gates Foundation, with much gratitude, funded our effort to actually experiment, to find a new way to tell a story about global poverty, and to do all the formative research, everything that I've talked about, evaluation research, to see whether or not we could communicate to an apathetic audience, find a new way to tell the story about global poverty. And so here's the story. A comic goes on a global search for the greatest comics in the developing world. Okay, so that's the big entertainment story. And if you think about it, comedians are natural outsiders, right? Stand-up comics are natural outsiders. So they're funny because they're pointing out crappy stuff. So it turns out in the developing world, as in the United States, in the developing world, when you are a stand-up comic, you're talking about observations of what's going on around you. And, in India, they were talking about poop jokes, because they were talking about sanitation. And if you know much about global poverty in India, you know that sanitation-related illness, lack of access to clean water, malnutrition that comes from the ripple effect of that kind of illness is a dramatic global health issue. And again, from an actionable opportunity standpoint, if you solve that one issue in India, you make a huge dent in the issue of global poverty. In South Africa, stand-up comics are talking about HIV. I don't know how many of you know that, that South Africa has the world's highest proportion of HIV infections. 1 in 10 South Africans actually infected with HIV. Starting to change, I should say. Both of these issues, a lot of progress on the horizon, but this is what the comics are talking about. And these are also the actionable opportunities. And so our idea was, if we create, the idea of Stand Up Planet, a documentary TV series we produced, was if we take these comics on a journey, one stand-up comic, Hassan, who's on The Daily Show now. I don't know how many of you are trying to figure out, like, how do I know that guy? He's on The Daily Show now. He goes on a quest to find these comics in the developing world and find out what they're talking about. And through doing that, he follows the jokes deep into the social issues. And so we're following that format of the study that I told you all about, which is you have the comedy, and then you immediately resolve it with the real information. And by the way, then tell people what to do about it, right? Which is a part of the campaign that I won't tell you about. So we wanted to create an entertainment experience and a great story. And then we also wanted to find out what happened, right? So here's where I go into just a little bit of a transition. And so my great mentor, I call him the love of my life, Norman Lear, who I worked for many years, such a great privilege, and so much of my lens on this work comes from his. And you know, one of his favorite catchphrases is, you have to know that your work matters, that it's making a dent and a ripple. And sometimes you can see the ripple, and sometimes it takes a while to see how it evolves out. And to me, this is the idea of evaluation in a lot of ways, okay? So I'm taking a big, beautiful metaphorical idea and talking about evaluation. But you know, documentaries inspire action in a really different way, and I want to say that really conclusively. There's a project that I work on with Participant Media. We've looked at 73 pieces of entertainment over the last year, and I can tell you on the back end of that work, looking at narrative film, documentary film, television, short videos, what comes out on top, there are two major takeaways. Documentaries inspire action in a totally different way than other forms of entertainment. There is some kind of an informal script that we have. The second piece is this idea of empathy and narrative transportation. This is when you look at all factors on the back end that audiences could respond to, and we used regression analysis to examine what was happening on the back end. The more transported you are into the story, regardless of what the social issue is about, regardless of what the emotion is that you experience, that is what determines whether or not you take action. It's a really conclusive set of information. And so I just want to quote here Tabitha Jackson, who runs the Sundance Documentary Project, wrote a really lovely piece in Filmmaker magazine a couple months ago, and she was quoting the work of a woman named Leslie Jamison, who wrote an amazing book about empathy. And she said, you know, documentaries are empathy machines, and they are empathy machines. And I guess what I'm saying is we have proof that empathy really matters really conclusively when you want to deal with attitude formation and behavior change. And so the ripple effect of evaluation, I think, telling the story about what happened allows us to tell the story about what we're doing on our projects, and it enables us to really build upon that. And so if we're not doing that kind of work, or we're doing it in an ad hoc kind of way, and we're not also using possible ideas, models, theoretical constructs, right? Narrative transportation, empathy, you can ask certain questions that get at those. There's a way that those research projects always feel very tactical, and then they're only married to that project. But once they start to have that feeling and you want to explain what happened, it was narrative transportation, it was empathy, it was this kind of thing, we can actually learn and build upon them. And when you're dealing with one social issue over many years, thinking about global poverty as a perfect example of this, we really need to know what works on that so that we can build on it. It's not enough for me to know that Stand Up Planet did well on X, Y, and Z, which I'll tell you about, but I want to know it for the next project and the next project, right? And so our evaluation of Stand Up Planet, we did experimental design. There's a whole printout of the report for you all, so I will not go into detail. But I'll tell you the two main takeaways that were really stunning for us was the comedy, and I won't go through the fancy stats that allowed us to conclude this, but I'll tell you there were fancy stats. The comedy and the entertainment was the factor that made a difference between that kind of storytelling and explanatory long-form storytelling. And what happened was people didn't just care about the global poverty issues, they cared about the daily lives of people living in poor countries around the world. And that, to me, was a huge revelation and such a validation of our approach. Because we were not just saying care about HIV and care about sanitation, we were really saying care about these people. And if we feel like they are not others and they are not different from us, then we'll do something about it. And that's the point of doing that kind of work.